First, big thanks to the agency for this invitation. I'm always very jealous of Slovenians who get this pleasure to live in this beautiful country. And of course to Andrei for inviting. Okay. We were asked to comment or discuss the assessment of exclusive dealing and conditional rebates as the Commission, European Commission, typically does it. And I decided to split this question into two sub-questions. First, I want to ask where we are in terms of assessment of such dealings. And then I would like to ask or discuss where we should be and if we are going there. So in terms of where are we, you will see I will ask a question if there is a presumption of harm for exclusive dealing arrangements by dominant and unavoidable sellers. And well, I will anticipate the answer. I don't know if there is such a presumption or not. I think there might be. If anybody else has a better insight in that, we'll be happy to discuss. But I will address this question last. So where should we be? So the question here is, how should exclusive dealing be assessed from the point of view of the economic literature or economic theories? So I'll discuss that and I'll give some reasons why I think the way I think. And indeed, you will see that it seems that everybody knows what is the right thing to do with respect to exclusive dealings. But not everybody knows, or few know, if we're going there. So I'm very happy if someone disagrees, and I would like you to raise this during the talk or after this short talk that I will give. Clearly, at first glance, conditional rebates and exclusivity, they prevent competition for some buyers or for some part of the demand for these buyers. And at first sight, it seems that they cannot be pro-competitive. And this perhaps led the courts in the EU to, for a long time, condemn such arrangements per se, or by object. But I think that there is hardly anyone who is naive enough to think that such exclusive dealings, such arrangements cannot be pro-competitive. In fact, economic literature has shown that when all firms can offer exclusivity rebates, competition is often enhanced, and it will be in a broad set of circumstances. There are circumstances in which this may not happen. We can discuss that later. But why is that? Why are they efficient when all firms can offer exclusivity rebates? It's interesting to actually look at the mechanism. Now, conditional rebates allow for a more efficient extraction of intramarginal rents, and thereby they provide incentives for firms to compete more intensively at the margin for marginal units. So for those units on which, for example, a retroactive rebate would apply. To put it in very simple terms, which is more intuitively appealing, exclusivity increases stakes in competition, and thereby firms will compete in terms of the terms, the overall terms, more intensively. I have provided some references for the papers, and they are at the back of the slides, so I can also expand on that later. Moreover, conditional rebate is a form of price discrimination, and price discrimination in general has ambiguous effects, but it is well known that the second order price discrimination, which such arrangements would qualify as, are often or typically enhancing consumer welfare because they basically increase demand, they increase total output. they allow more consumers to be served. Okay, so these are, how to put it, very fundamental and in a way simple reasons why such rebates may be efficient. The concern, of course, that the antitrust authority would have would not be typically focused on exclusivity arrangements or conditional rebates or market share agreements, which are not individualized. Typically, the concern is with individualized rebates and retroactive rebates. But in order for this previous argument to apply, you actually need to offer individualized rebates because the competition at the margin, or this mechanism which works at the margin, can only be effective when you can locate the margin of individual purchases with a particular scheme, discount scheme. So there's also some literature listed there that shows this. With respect to retroactive rebates, it has also been shown that in certain settings, which are relevant in certain circumstances, not in all, by no means, and I'll get to the circumstances in which exclusive rebates are harmful. So please be patient if somebody is impatient. They do not allow for larger rent extraction in the context of, for example, the model of Marvel and Young. So what I want to say here is that there is a fundamental mechanism which tells us that exclusive rebates may be efficient. Now, another point that I wanted to make in that regard is, if this is the case, and if we accept that this may be a competitive outcome, so if we accept that such schemes may lead to a more intensive competition, then we must also accept a certain competitive outcome, and that is a competitive outcome such that in a given market, one firm is seen to be employing exclusive contracts. And perhaps those others who didn't win these deals do not. They might compete for part of demand of a buyer which is contestable or which is not covered by quasi-exclusive contracts. But that does not mean that consumers are worse off compared to the situation without such contracts. Clearly, it follows from that. There are other reasons for why exclusive dealing might be efficient, and that has been discussed in literature very widely, broadly, and the three perhaps most known such mechanisms are the free rider problem, and exclusive dealing can address it and resolve it. So here we can, we can see a situation in which a seller wants to provide incentives for a downstream reseller to advertise, but the downstream seller knows that if he advertises, spends some money on advertising, but then another seller who didn't spend this money can sell into his area, he will not incur such costs. And that cost might sometimes be efficient, and exclusive dealing might ensure that the incentives are aligned across along the supply chain. The other mechanism is recovery of fixed costs. So sometimes a seller will make relationship-specific investments, which he cannot then capitalize or sell if the relationship breaks down. They are not as valuable outside that particular relationship. And in that case, the buyer would, so to speak, hold up, would exercise a hold up. And exclusive dealing can help resolve this problem. And the third set of reasons has to do with alignment of incentives. I don't want to go too much into detail on this, but you know, it also has to do with, for example, inducing sales efforts of the downstream resellers of, for example, post-sales services and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's sum this up. Let's sum the good stuff about exclusivity, and we'll move to the bad stuff. What I want to say, the message that I want to give, and it's my opinion, but it's also, I think, an opinion of most economists, including, I dare say, many economists in the Commission, that presumption of harm for exclusive dealings is not warranted, because it can lead to a more intensive competition, as I said, and address certain externalities. Second, that when we observe exclusivity in the market, this is not necessarily an indication that something is wrong with competition. And third point, even when some firms employ exclusivity rebates, whereas others do not, it is not, you know, is not necessarily an indication that there is something wrong again. And again, there's some models in that regard. So what about the circumstances in which exclusivity rebates and quasi-exclusivity and market share agreements are harmful? There are basically two sets of theories of harm. One is in which there is a profit sacrifice involved, and this is somewhat akin to predation. And the other one, I think, more interesting one, and often, I think, and with respect to the first one, I think there is a, and I think Adina will say later something on that, the as efficient competitor test has some bite. And the second one is when there is no or very little profit sacrifice involved. And I'll just address this very briefly. So, following the Chicago critique, which actually completely shut off, how to put it, the prosecution of exclusivity rebates in the US for, I don't know, decade or two. The post-Chicago school found some reasons and some circumstances, and I think, you know, potentially good reasons, when exclusivity rebates can harm competition. And the most basic and the most simple model is one by Rasmussen, where he basically argues that when coordination between buyers is missing, and the entrant must cover some fixed costs to cover the cost of entry, so when entry involves fixed costs, you could basically offer, or you could basically use the fact that as a dominant seller, you could use the fact that that buyers cannot coordinate in order to basically exclude entry. And the mechanism is not a very complex one. What happens basically is that as long as the entrant needs to sell to more than, let's say, 2 buyers, the seller could, in principle, the incumbent could, in principle, go to different buyers and offer them a sufficient compensation in order to induce them. And then each of these downstream buyers will actually require a very small compensation because it believes that other buyers will accept these exclusive deals, and so the entrant will be excluded. And if they then do not sign the exclusive deal, they will not benefit from a discount. So the discount can be very small, in fact. The one thing that I want to sort of raise here is that scale economies or network effects must be present in order for such theories of harm to fly. There must be certain externalities from a contract, and in this case, in the case of Rasmussen, the externality is in the form of the benefit to one buyer of the exclusivity is actually cost to the other because a more efficient entrant might be excluded. Okay. not to take too much time from Adina, because I think she has some very interesting things to say, but perhaps this one is interesting because it did play a role in the Intel case, but the court didn't pick up on this particular theory of harm, even if the Commission had actually prominently put it in the decision. And it's interesting because it illustrates the fact how competition, how downstream competition actually plays a role in the analysis. So what I mean by downstream competition? Well, typically the buyers are not final customers, but they are firms which buy inputs, and then they use these inputs in competition downstream. And the nature of this competition downstream is actually relevant to the analysis. It can either make, it can either create a condition or facilitate anti-competitive exclusion, or it can make such an exclusion harder. So it is important to look at that as well. Yeah, I'm thinking whether to go into this, Adina. Are you telling us later something about this mechanism, arbitrary right mechanism? No? Okay. So it's interesting perhaps because, well, it did feature prominently in Intel, and I would like to actually discuss the consequences of Intel if that's interesting later. So if buyers compete downstream in a situation that I described earlier, then they will care about the relative levels of input prices, not about absolute. Because if they can pass through a price increase. If the price increase for input happens simultaneously for all the competitors, they will just pass it through, no problem. We don't care. But if somebody gets a better price, that's really bad. And if somebody gets a better price and the competition is intensive, well, that's bad, because then this guy will expand and I will be marginal. So it is this concern that a dominant seller, which has some non-contestable demand, and that's important in this theory of harm, can use in order to make small concessions and sort of lock the demand through exclusivity rebates, and that would could in turn, or might often be harmful for consumers. So you need a non-contestable part of the demand, and non-contestable part is the demand which rivals of the dominant firm cannot really challenge. So in Intel case, Intel was a must-carry, for example, and people wanted Intel-based PCs, so that assumption was probably justified. So the guidance, the EC guidance, conveniently called guidance on enforcement priorities, and I think we'll get to why this is actually now coming very handy after the Intel judgment. Did recognize, and in fact it did push this economic view on exclusivity very much, and it did recognize explicitly the relevance of contestability and scale economies, network economies, and I think Adina will indeed speak more on that. So the previous mechanism I said is one in which intensive downstream competition can facilitate exclusionary rebates, exclusivity rebates. But in a paper by Fumagalli and Mota, 2006, they show that in some circumstances, intensive competition, downstream competition, can actually also make anti-competitive effects from an exclusivity rebate less likely. Let me not go into detail, but basically the mechanism is there is that if the competition is very intensive, small cost advantage will translate into a big expansion of output. So if there is an efficient entrant and a single buyer who can get a cheap input, then even if currently it has a small demand, by sponsoring the entry, will expand the output sufficiently in order to overcome the scale economies of the entrant. So, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that it's tricky. It is a very tricky issue, and it can be pro-competitive. It can also be anti-competitive, but the risk of type 1 errors is high. We can deal with it, but not in the manner of a, per se prohibition. We can deal with it, I think. So, summary. What should we be doing? There is no basis for a presumption of harm. I don't know an economist who would say otherwise. Their exclusivity rebates are often efficient, even when offered by a dominant firm. And for this reason, a well-developed theory of harm is important, because we do want to avoid wrongful convictions. They will harm consumers. And I wanted to make actually analogy to low uniform prices here. Now, low prices are good. Oh, wait a minute, what about predation? We should be very careful with predation. But so, we should also be careful with exclusivity rebates. So, I just wanted to spend a few words on what a well-developed theory of harm, basically the only tool that can help us manage the risk of type 1 errors and at the same time minimize the risk of type 2 errors, basically the risk of wrongful convictions, and for letting the risk at the same time the risk of letting the bad guys go, is that we should have a well-developed theory of harm which lays out all the relevant assumptions and provides, evidence that, to the extent possible. Why is it important that we lay all the relevant assumptions out? So that the parties in the process can catch those assumptions which are wrong, to preserve the right to defense, and at the same time to minimize the risk of type 1 errors. Second, it must lay out all the logical steps and verify their consistency with the incentives of all the parties, of the buyer, of the seller, of the entrant. And third thing, which these two things are kind of obvious, but third thing is also obvious, but is often overlooked. A well-developed theory of harm should clearly outline the most likely counterfactual that it is using. It should say, I am using this counterfactual. Why is that important? Well, because a theory of harm basically evaluates the effect of the concerned conduct against something else, against a but-for scenario. But we must know what that but-for scenario is, so that we can either say yes, we agree with it, or no, and here is why. This is very important. It's really the fundament, but it's often overlooked. We need to know what happens if we prohibit this particular type of behavior, and we need to spell it out. Okay, my opinion. All right, so that was what we should be doing, but what are we doing? I put a smiley. Yeah, no need to point it. Because the EC guidance paper did something good. I think many economists, even though we're always grumpy and we try to find some, Italians call it, no, Spanish call it pepito grigio. It's somebody who tries to find some small problem somewhere. We always do. But, overall, I think we were happy. Not least because it's our bread to do economics. But the EC guidance paper laid out really nicely effects-based analysis. And it was informed by the economic literature. Yes, there were many sort of safeguards. They didn't go quite as far as they should, but that's okay. And firms formed legitimate expectations on the basis of that. But then the Into judgment came out, and it turned this upside down entirely. It seems that now we have a per se prohibition on exclusivity link if it is done by a dominant company which has some significant uncontestable demand. But, you know, is this right? Well, economics tells us that that's not right. Of course, there are many questions that appear. I can tell you, the community in Brussels and elsewhere is a little bit confused. We don't know how the Commission will proceed in cases. I think the Commission doesn't know itself how it will proceed in these cases. I don't think that the Commission actually liked the Intel judgment. This is, of course, my opinion, and Adina will then comment, viciously attack me, and Tobias will. Very good. And you know, please do, because otherwise it will be boring just us here preaching something. Yeah, and what? Okay, so here is how I think the Commission wants to go about it. They will say, well, you know, it's true that firms may have formed legitimate expectations, but we said that the guidance paper is on enforcement priorities. It's not about assessment of cases in our decisions. It is about selection of cases. That's how they'll go about it. Is that good? I think it is bad. And why is it bad? Because if you select cases on that basis, but then write decision on another basis, there is confusion. There is no discipline. We cannot test the reasoning. And such legitimate expectations are completely void of any meaning. So I think this is bad. And I think that the Commission, you know, feels a little bit, a little bit concerned. Okay. Now, there is some new case law that hopefully resolves these dilemmas, that hopefully fixes, this problem that Intel has created. Is it going to be resolved anytime soon? I don't think so, but it might be going in the right direction. And it's carte bancaire that I have in mind here. And what carte bancaire does is it imposes some criteria that must be sort of satisfied for a by-object infringement to go through. And it imposes a little bit stricter, how to put it, a little bit higher hurdle for the Commission. In effect, a conduct which is a candidate by object infringement must be assessed in the legal and economic context for a potential or for high risk, let's say, or of a significant harm, and then it can qualify for a by object infringement. And yeah, that's it.